Trump threatens 100% tariffs after Canada-China deal sparks economic rift. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to impose a sweeping 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, following Canada's decision to finalize a bilateral trade agreement with China, an agreement Trump himself publicly praised just 1 week earlier. The sudden reversal has exposed what analysts describe as a moment of political panic rather than a calculated policy shift, as Canada moves to reduce its economic dependence on the U.S. market under Prime Minister Mark Carney's leadership. From praise to punishment in 8 days. On January 16th, after Carney concluded trade talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing, Trump spoke positively about the deal from the White House. That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that, Trump told reporters. Just 8 days later, Trump's tone changed dramatically. Following Carney's widely praised speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump accused Canada of attempting to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods destined for the U.S., warning that China would eat Canada alive and destroy its economy, social fabric, and way of life. What actually changed? The trade deal did not change. What changed was Canada's posture. At Davos, Carney declared that the American-led international economic order is over, arguing that middle powers like Canada must pursue strategic autonomy in a world where great powers increasingly use tariffs as leverage, financial systems as coercion tools, and supply chains as weapons. He did not mention Trump by name, but the message was unmistakable. The following day, Trump responded with blunt rhetoric of his own, claiming that Canada lives because of the United States, receives freebies, and should be grateful before making such statements. The episode revealed a deeper fault line: Canada's refusal to remain economically subordinate. What the China deal really is and isn't. Contrary to Trump's claims, the agreement does not turn Canada into a Chinese satellite state. Instead, it is a targeted trade arrangement aimed at resolving agricultural disputes that have severely impacted Canadian farmers. In 2024, the Trudeau government imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, aligning with similar measures taken by the United States and the European Union. Canada was acting as a coordinated ally, following Washington's lead on China policy. China responded in March 2025 with retaliatory tariffs, 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil, peas, and other agricultural products, 25% tariffs on pork and seafood, including lobster. In August, an additional tariff pushed canola seed duties to nearly 76% combined. The Beijing agreement negotiated by Carney was designed to ease these pressures and restore market access for Canadian farmers and exporters, not to undercut the United States. The real fear: Canadian economic independence. Trump's tariff threat appears to be less about China and more about Canada's growing economic independence. By diversifying trade relationships and reducing reliance on the U.S. market, Canada weakens Washington's leverage, a shift Trump has consistently opposed. What was once smart diplomacy became almost overnight a justification for economic retaliation, the moment Canada stopped pretending to be subordinate. The whiplash has been extraordinary, but to many observers, it has also been revealing.
Canada-China trade deal delivers relief as farmers face severe losses. The urgency behind Canada's trade negotiations with China was driven by a looming economic crisis in the agricultural sector. A Chinese anti-dumping investigation was scheduled to conclude in March 2026, a decision that could have made punitive tariffs permanent, an outcome Canadian farmers described as catastrophic. Saskatchewan, which produces more than 50% of Canada's canola, was hit especially hard. China had long been a $4 billion annual market for Canadian canola seed. After Chinese buyers disappeared, total canola exports fell by more than 2 million tons. Pork exports collapsed. In Atlantic Canada, lobster and crab fishermen watched key markets vanish almost overnight. Facing mounting pressure, Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Beijing to negotiate relief. The deal, a measured compromise. The agreement struck was narrowly targeted and highly specific. Canada agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles per year to enter the Canadian market at a 6.1% tariff, down sharply from the previous 100% rate. That volume roughly matches China's EV exports to Canada in 2023, before tariffs were imposed, and represents less than 3% of Canada's domestic auto market. In exchange, China agreed to reduce canola seed tariffs to approximately 15% by March, remove discriminatory tariffs on canola meal, peas, lobster, and crab from March through at least the end of 2026. The agreement unlocked nearly $3 billion in export orders for Canadian producers. This is basic trade diplomacy, Carney said, calling the deal enormous progress. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, who joined Carney in Beijing, echoed that sentiment, calling it very good news for Canada and Saskatchewan. From approval to outrage. Initially, Donald Trump agreed. That's what he should be doing, Trump said at the time. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. That approval ended abruptly after Carney took the global stage. Davos, Canada breaks with American hegemony. On January 20th, Carney delivered a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos that many analysts say will be studied for years. Titled Principled and Pragmatic, Canada's Path, the address marked Canada's most explicit public break from US-led economic dominance in decades. Carney opened bluntly. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. He argued that crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have exposed the dangers of extreme global integration, and that great powers are now weaponizing that integration. Without naming the United States or Donald Trump, Carney warned that tariffs are being used as leverage, financial systems as coercive tools, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to exploit. The implication was unmistakable, especially as Trump was openly threatening tariffs against NATO allies and economic punishment against countries that resisted his foreign policy demands. Carney cautioned that the institutions middle powers have relied on, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, and global climate forums, are increasingly under threat. As a result, countries are concluding they must develop strategic autonomy in food, energy, finance, critical minerals, and supply chains. Then came the line that resonated worldwide. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Canada's new strategy. Carney outlined Canada's response. Build strength at home. Engage globally with open eyes. Take the world as it is, not as Canada wishes it to be. Prioritize shared values while remaining pragmatic where interests diverge. It was a declaration of independence in everything but name, and one that explains why a trade deal once praised became a justification for threats almost overnight.
Davos speech marks a turning point as Trump escalates tariff threats against Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney's address at the World Economic Forum in Davos marked a decisive turning point in Canada-US relations and set the stage for Donald Trump's abrupt escalation from praise to open economic threats. Carney closed his speech with a line that drew a rare standing ovation at Davos. We can no longer rely only on the strength of values, but also on the value of strength. Such applause is unusual at the forum. Global leaders praised the message. French President Emmanuel Macron echoed similar themes, arguing Europe must reduce dependence on American economic coercion. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen spoke of building a more independent Europe capable of standing on its own. Trump, who addressed Davos the following day, appeared visibly angry. Canada should be grateful to us, he said. Canada gets a lot of freebies from the United States. He did not specify what those freebies were. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, before you make your statements. Carney pushes back.
Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership, economically, in security, and through deep cultural ties. But Canada does not live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our own house. This is our country. This is our future. The choice is ours. It was at that moment, analysts say, that Trump's entire posture toward the Canada-China deal shifted. From praise to threats. On January 16th, Trump praised Carney's China agreement. By January 24th, after the Davos speeches and Carney's refusal to adopt a subordinate tone, Trump was threatening what amounted to economic annihilation. The threat came via Truth Social on Saturday morning. Trump referred to Carney as Governor Carney, the same mocking label he previously used for Justin Trudeau when floating the idea of Canada becoming the 51st U.S. state. Trump claimed Canada was attempting to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the United States. China will eat Canada alive. He warned of the destruction of Canadian businesses, social cohesion, and way of life. If Canada proceeds with the China deal, Trump said it would face 100% tariffs on all goods entering the United States. Why the threat makes no sense. The threat is extraordinary for several reasons. First, Canada has already finalized the deal with China. It is set to take effect on March 1st. Trump praised it just days earlier. Now he is threatening retroactive punishment for an agreement he initially endorsed. Second, the deal has nothing to do with Chinese goods flooding the U.S. market. The 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles allowed into Canada under reduced tariffs are intended for the Canadian market only. They are not being re-exported to the United States. Canada is not becoming a transshipment hub. Third, a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods would trigger economic catastrophe on both sides of the border. In 2024, Canada exported $352 billion in goods to the United States, products American companies rely on, including lumber, aluminum, steel, oil, natural gas, and automotive parts. Doubling prices overnight would severely damage U.S. industries and raise costs for American consumers. Fourth, such tariffs would violate the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which Trump himself negotiated and signed during his first term. The agreement explicitly restricts arbitrary tariff actions of this kind.
What this is really about? None of that, analysts argue, is the point. This dispute is not about Chinese electric vehicles or trade enforcement. It is about Canada refusing to be subordinate. For decades, Canada has routed the vast majority of its trade through the United States. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports go south of the border. Canadian businesses, supply chains, and investment decisions have long been built around American demand. That dependence gave Washington enormous leverage. When the U.S. threatened tariffs, Canadian governments had little choice but to respond. Carney is systematically dismantling that leverage. The China deal is only one element of a broader strategy. His government has pursued new energy partnerships with Qatar, strengthened trade and critical minerals ties with the European Union, and we opened pathways for deeper engagement with India after years of strained relations. Infrastructure projects, such as the Churchill Port expansion and Hudson Bay Railway, aim to give Canada direct access to European markets without relying on U.S. infrastructure. Every diversified trade route reduces American leverage. Every alternative market limits Washington's ability to coerce. Every supply chain that bypasses U.S. territory represents a step toward economic independence. A strategic shift, not a single deal. At Davos, Carney made that strategy explicit. He was not simply talking about China or Europe. He was outlining a comprehensive doctrine of strategic autonomy, building strength at home,
diversifying partnerships abroad, and reducing vulnerability to coercion from any single power, including the United States. Trump initially praised the China deal because he believed it was a narrow, bilateral fix to trade irritants. Once Carney explained it was part of a larger plan to reduce dependence on the U.S., the same agreement suddenly became an existential threat. Ontario Premier Doug Ford criticized the reduction in EV tariffs, warning it could harm Ontario's auto sector and anger Washington. He was right about one thing: it did anger Trump, but not because of electric vehicles. Trump is angry because Canada negotiated independently, asserted its own interests, and demonstrated to other middle powers that alternatives to American economic dominance exist. On the same day he issued his tariff threat, Trump also revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, underscoring how quickly diplomacy gave way to punishment once Canada refused to bow. Trump withdrew Peace Board invite as tariff threats deepened Canada-US rift. The final rupture came quietly but symbolically. The International Board of Peace, which reportedly cost $1 billion to join and claims to oversee global peace processes, withdrew Canada's invitation shortly after Prime Minister Mark Carney's Davos speech. Carney had expressed cautious interest in the initiative. The withdrawal was not tied to policy differences or security concerns. It followed a speech Trump did not like. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty, not cooperation, was the price of entry. This has long been Trump's pattern. Public disagreement is treated as disloyalty. Deference is rewarded. Independence is punished. The revocation of Canada's invitation was intended as discipline. Instead, it validated everything Carney argued in Davos. A threat that likely cannot be enforced. Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods is likely unenforceable in practice. Permanent tariffs of that magnitude would require congressional approval, devastate American industries dependent on Canadian inputs, and violate the USMCA trade agreement, which Canada and Mexico could challenge through formal dispute mechanisms. Such an action would unite American business lobbies, Canadian provincial governments, and international trade institutions against Washington. But enforcement is not the point. The damage is already being done. Uncertainty as a weapon. Canadian businesses planning investments must now question whether access to the U.S. market can be relied upon. Companies considering expanding production in Canada must factor in the risk that American policy could arbitrarily double export costs overnight. Even without implementation, the threat alone injects uncertainty, discouraging investment, slowing growth, and reshaping long-term economic decisions. Carney's response is expected to remain measured. Canada is unlikely to retaliate immediately. Ottawa will proceed with the China deal because the benefits to Canadian farmers are real, tangible, and immediate. And Carney will continue building alternative partnerships because reducing dependence on the U.S. market has moved from strategic preference to economic necessity. The world is watching. Other middle powers are paying close attention. If Canada can negotiate with China despite U.S. objections, if Carney can openly criticize great power coercion without suffering actual economic annihilation, then strategic autonomy moves from theory to precedent. That is what Trump fears most. Not Chinese electric vehicles, not Canada as a transshipment hub, but the realization that American economic dominance is optional. A sudden reversal with one explanation. The central absurdity remains striking. On January 16th, Trump said Carney signing a trade deal with China was a good thing. By January 24th, the same deal supposedly justified 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. Nothing about the agreement changed. The terms remain exactly as announced in Beijing. Limited Chinese EV imports for the Canadian market, reduced Chinese tariffs on cannella, lobster, crab, and peas, clear benefits for Canadian agriculture, manageable risks for the auto sector,
and a net positive for the Canadian economy. What changed was Carney's willingness to explain why the deal mattered. At Davos, he made clear it was not just transactional trade, but part of a broader effort to build partnerships and strategic autonomy to ensure Canada could withstand economic coercion from great powers that use integration as a form of subordination. Trump praised the deal when he believed it was tactical. When it became clear it represented independence rather than deference, the reaction turned to panic. Panic, not power. Trump's 100% tariff threat is an admission, not a strategy. If American leverage depends on Canadian dependence, and Canada is actively reducing that dependence, then escalation becomes the only tool left. Threaten total economic rupture. Hope fear forces submission. Carney anticipated this logic in Davos. He argued that sovereignty, once grounded in rules, is increasingly anchored in the capacity to resist coercion. The real choice for middle powers is not whether to adapt to great power rivalry, but whether to retreat behind walls or build cooperation among themselves. Canada has chosen cooperation. With China on agriculture and EVs, with Europe on critical minerals and energy, with Qatar on LNG, with Denmark on Arctic security, and with other middle powers who recognize that American reliability under Trump can no longer be assumed. Every partnership weakens coercion. Every alternative market reduces leverage. Every demonstration that Canada can thrive without permission undermines the subordination Trump demands. The China deal was always going to help Canadian farmers. That is why Trump initially praised it. But once it became clear that the deal symbolized strategic autonomy rather than tactical bargaining, it transformed into a threat. Faced with a middle power refusing to stay on the menu, Trump chose escalation over adaptation. That is not strength. It is panic. And the 100% tariff threat proves that everything Carney warned about in Davos was exactly right.